Think of a place where a neighbor's misfortune is treated like a spectator sport, where hands are only extended to grab, never to give, and where a discarded, mud-caked shoe holds the weight of a kingdom's forgotten crown. The village of Omaliko was a paradise of golden sunlight and swaying palms, but beneath its canopy lay a heart of stone. It was a world governed by the price of the soul. If a person couldn't pay, they didn't exist. Within this harsh marketplace, we find Grace, a young woman whose vibrant spirit is trapped in threadbare wrappers. While others sharpen their tongues to cheat the next buyer, Grace is burdened by a dangerous softness that the village finds offensive. Her life is a constant tug-of-war between her own hunger and the need of those even poorer than herself. Her moral compass is set by her ailing father, who often reminds her through the smoke of their cooking fire, "Grace, the world will try to harden you so they can break you. Stay soft, my daughter, for a gentle hand is the only thing strong enough to hold a miracle when it finally arrives." The red dust of Omaliko did more than just coat the yams and the vibrant fabrics in the market. It seemed to settle over the hearts of the people, turning them into something brittle and dry. In Omaliko, compassion was a currency no one traded in. If a merchant's cart overturned, the crowd didn't rush to help gather the spilled grain, they rushed to pocket it. Laughter here was rarely joyful, it was usually directed at someone else's shame. The elders sat on their carved stools, eyes narrowed, calculating the worth of their neighbors by the size of their barns and the depth of their pockets. To be poor was to be invisible, and to be kind was to be a target. Grace walked through this landscape of indifference with a quiet, careful grace that belied her name. She saw the way the younger children mimicked the cruelty of their parents, pelting stray dogs with stones and jeering at the infirm. It was a place where the sun shone brightly on the palms, but the shadows between the houses felt cold and predatory. Every morning, she whispered her father's words to herself like a prayer, a shield against the abrasive spirit of the village. She knew that if she let the dust of Omaliko into her own heart, she would lose the only thing the marketplace couldn't price, her soul. The weight of the vegetable basket on Grace's head was nothing compared to the heaviness in her chest as she watched her father's breath grow shallow each evening. Her stall was small, tucked away in the least desirable corner of the market where the mud lingered longest. She sold bitter leaf and garden eggs, but the profits were meager, barely enough to buy the herbs her father needed to keep his fever at bay. Customers would often haggle her down to the last cowrie, knowing she was too desperate to refuse, their eyes gleaming with the triumph of a small, mean victory. One afternoon, as the heat reached a suffocating peak, Grace counted her coins. She had just enough for a small portion of fish for her father's broth. As she tucked the coins into the knot of her wrapper, she felt the weight of the journey ahead. The road to Omaliko is long, and stories like this remind us that we are all travelers looking for a place of rest. If you feel the warmth of Grace's spirit, perhaps you choose to subscribe and walk this path with us until the very end. She looked up and saw the other traders watching her, waiting for her to stumble, their faces masks of cynical expectation. She appeared like a ghost of the village's conscience, huddled near the iron-rod gates where the wealthy merchants lived. The woman was a mass of grey rags and matted hair, her skin so dry it looked like parched earth. Most people walked past her as if she were a pile of refuse, some even pulling their garments tight to avoid the contamination of her poverty. This was Mama Udo. She didn't beg with words, she simply held out a trembling, empty hand, her eyes clouded with cataracts and ancient exhaustion. Grace stopped. The crowd shifted around her like a river around a stone, voices rising in irritation at the blockage. Grace reached into her basket and pulled out the small piece of dried fish she had just purchased, her father's dinner. She placed it in the woman's hand. Mama Udo's fingers closed around the food with surprising strength. The old woman looked up, and for a second, the clouds in her eyes seemed to clear, revealing a gaze that was sharp and uncomfortably knowing. She didn't say thank you, she simply watched Grace as if reading the secret architecture of her heart. The peace was shattered by the sharp click of Madame Obidi's expensive beads. Obidi was the queen of the marketplace, a woman whose wealth was built on the high interest she charged those in debt. Seeing Mama Udo near her shop front, she recoiled in performative disgust. "Get this filth away from my sight!" Obidi shrieked, signaling her guards. The men moved in, grabbing Mama Udo by her frail arms, intending to drag her to the village lockup for vagrancy. The crowd gathered, their faces lighting up with the cruel excitement that only a public shaming could provide. "Stop!" Grace cried out, pushing through the onlookers. She stood between the guards and the trembling old woman. Madam Obidi laughed, a sound like glass breaking. And who will pay the fine for her presence, little girl? You. Grace felt the eyes of the village burning into her. Without a word, she reached into the knot of her wrapper and pulled out her last savings, the money intended for her father's next month of medicine. She pressed it into Obidi's palm. The merchant's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in contempt. She took the money, spat on the ground near Grace's feet, and walked away, leaving Grace with nothing but an empty purse and an old woman who looked at her with a terrifyingly calm intensity. When the crowd dispersed, disappointed that no blood was shed, Mama Udo reached into the folds of her tattered rags. Grace expected a blessing or perhaps a story, but instead, the woman produced a single, filthy leather shoe. It was a man's shoe, the leather cracked and caked in layers of dried mud, the buckle rusted short. It looked like something a dog had chewed and abandoned in a swamp. Mama Udo pressed it into Grace's hands. "Take this," the old woman whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "It is the only gratitude I have." Grace stared at the object. It was useless, a single shoe for a foot that wasn't hers. She looked up to ask Mama Udo where the other one was, or what she was supposed to do with it, but the old woman was already shuffling away into the shadows of the evening. Grace stood alone in the darkening market, holding the foul-smelling relic. It felt heavy, disproportionately heavy, but she didn't throw it away. She tucked it into her basket, hiding it beneath the few wilted leaves she had left, and began the long walk home to her father. The news of Grace's trade traveled faster than the morning sun. By the time she reached the market the next day, the jeers were waiting. "Where is your courage, shoe queen?" one trader yelled, pointing at her feet. Madam Obidi had told everyone how Grace had traded her father's lifeblood for a piece of trash. They called her the Fool of Omaliko, a cautionary tale for anyone who thought kindness paid. Grace sat in her stall, the old shoe tucked under her stool, enduring the spit and the laughter that rained down on her. The mockery cut deep. It wasn't just the words, it was the realization that these people truly believed her goodness was a mental illness. Even the children joined in, dancing around her stall and singing songs about the girl who bought a dead man's shoe. Sometimes, the weight of a choice can feel like a mountain, and we wonder if we are truly alone in our values. If you've ever felt the sting of being misunderstood for doing the right thing, share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know that Grace is not the only one holding onto her heart in a cold world. That night, as her father slept in a fitful, feverish haze, Grace sat by the dying embers of the fire. She pulled the shoe out of her basket. The stench was fading, replaced by a strange, metallic scent. Using a small knife and a damp cloth, she began to scrape away the layers of Omaliko mud. As the filth fell away, she realized the leather wasn't just old, it was high-grade hide, preserved by the very mud that had hidden it. But it was the buckle that stopped her breath. Underneath the rust and grime, the buckle didn't show the dull gray of iron. It shimmered. Grace rubbed it harder with the corner of her wrapper. A deep, buttery yellow began to glow in the firelight. It wasn't brass. It was solid, heavy gold. Her hands shook. She realized the shoe had been intentionally weighted with a lining of lead to hide its true value. As she pried at the heel, she found a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a signet ring, cold and regal, bearing an emblem she recognized from the old stories of the village's founding, the lost seal of the royal lineage that had vanished decades ago. The next morning, Grace ran to the gates where she had first met Mama Udo, the shoe hidden beneath her shawl. She had to find the woman, she had to return this treasure. But the gates were empty. She asked the street sweepers, the water carriers, even the guards. No one had seen the beggar woman. It was as if she had dissolved into the morning mist. To make matters worse, Madam Obidi was waiting at Grace's store when she returned. "The time is up, Grace," Obidi sneered, holding a legal scroll. "Your father's debts have matured. You have 48 hours to pay, or your house is mine." Grace felt the world tilting. She had a gold-buckled shoe, but how could she sell it without being accused of theft? The villagers would never believe it was a gift. They would say she robbed the old woman she pretended to help. For 2 days, She stayed by her father's side, the signet ring pressed against her palm, praying for a miracle. The silence of the village felt like a physical weight, a predatory waiting. The people of Omaliko were watching, ready to see the soft girl finally broken and cast into the street. The festival of the first harvest arrived, a day of mandatory village gathering at the central square. This was the day Madam Obidi intended to publicly seize Grace's land. The square was packed with thousands, the air thick with the smell of roasting yams. Grace stood at the edge, holding her father's hand as he leaned heavily on a staff. Obidi stepped onto the raised platform, grinning at the chief. "Justice must be served," she shouted. But as she began to read the death, a horn blast silenced the square. A procession emerged from the forest path, luxury carriages draped in royal blue George fabric. A woman stepped out, and the square fell so silent you could hear the wind in the palms. She was draped in coral beads that clattered like soft rain, her skin glowing with expensive oils. It was Mama Udo. She didn't look like a beggar, she looked like an empress. She walked through the crowd, which parted like the sea, and stopped in front of Grace. "The test is over," she said, her voice now resonant and powerful. She turned to the chief and held up a hand. "I am the widow of Udoka, the guardian of the ancestral lands. And I have found the only heart in Omaliko that did not rot." Mama Udo took the signet ring from Grace's trembling hand and placed it on her own finger, then turned to the village. "You mocked her for a shoe," she said, her voice echoing off the mud walls of the square. "But she cared for the shoe because she cared for the giver. Because of her, this village will not be raised by the crown for its cruelty. But from this day, the laws change." She declared Grace the administrator of the Udoka estate, effectively making her the wealthiest woman in the region, and the new protector of Omaliko. Grace didn't use her power for revenge. She built a house for her father and a clinic for the village, but she also erected a statue in the center of the marketplace. It wasn't a statue of a king or a god. It was a simple, oversized stone shoe, polished until it shone like gold. It served as a permanent reminder to the people of Omaliko that the smallest act of kindness could hold the weight of a kingdom. As we finish this journey together, we thank you for your time and your heart. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to remember the power of staying soft in a hard world. Grace lived the rest of her days proving that her father was right. A gentle hand is indeed the only thing strong enough to hold a miracle. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who believes in kindness, and subscribe for more powerful African stories where truth always finds its voice.